welcome to everyone joining us today for Indian Country 101, a learning opportunity for the rest of us. We're fortunate today to be joined by some of the creators of this program, as well as one nonprofit executive who will be sharing his journey. And before we get started, we'd just like to thank the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management for underwriting programs of this type so that we are able to share these opportunities with you. And we'll just talk a little bit about the Natural Areas Association. For those who do not know us, we are a national nonprofit organization that serves those who steward the land to protect biodiversity. Our mission is to get quality science and best practices into the hands of those who can make an impact on the ground by sharing applied science, practical solutions, and new knowledge through both in-person and digital opportunities. NAA's digital content includes symposia, webinars, videos, and we release content every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on our YouTube channel. We also publish the Natural Areas Journal, a quarterly peer-reviewed journal, as well as distribute the Natural Areas News twice a month, which is emailed directly to your inbox. So we hope you enjoy those deliverables. NAA is available wherever you are located, wherever you are in your practice, wherever you are in your career, and most importantly, whenever you have. Also just want to share information about the Natural Areas Conference. It's always fun to be back in person. The 2024 Natural Areas Conference, where science meets stewardship, will be held October 7 to 10, 2024 in Manhattan, Kansas. The Natural Areas Conference is a forum for information exchange among natural areas practitioners across North America. Participants have shared countless stories about how information gained from their participation in this conference has had a direct impact on the lands they steward. Registration for the conference will open June 3, and information is being updated on our website all the time. Oops. So if you want to know more about the conference or any other NAA events or publications, you can use this QR code and check out our website, naturalareas.org. So before I introduce today's presenters, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you wish to use closed captions during this program, you may do so by selecting Show Captions located on the Zoom navigation bar. And we encourage you to participate in the session by posting comments or shared resources in chat. But please post all your questions in Q&A. They tend to get lost in chat. It's much easier for us and the speakers to keep track of questions in Q&A. And we'll address as many as we can during the presentation and after the presenters are done. Also, please note that this program is being recorded and everyone registered for the webinar will receive an email with a link to the recording in about a week. And we will also be sharing a PDF of the slides. So now let me get started with our presenters. Jennifer Whitener Ulrich is the co-owner of the Whitener Group. Jen serves as the COO of the Whitener Group and provides strategic facilitation and economic development support for tribes and tribal enterprises. As the former business development director for Island Enterprises, IEI, the Economic Development Corporation for Squaxin Island Tribe, Jennifer was in charge of marketing and advertising for IEI's 8 diverse businesses. She was also responsible for researching, writing, and implementing business plans for many of the tribally owned corporations. Jennifer holds an MBA in Sustainable Business from Pinchot University, and her expertise lies in economic development, strategic planning, nonprofit organizational development, entrepreneurial systems, marketing, and financial analysis. Also joining us today is John Hoekstra, who's the Executive Director of Greenway Trust. John leads the Greenway Trust as Executive Director, working with the Board of Directors, staff, and partners to collaboratively conserve the Mountains to Sound Greenway landscape. He brings the Greenway a unique blend of scientific understandings, strategic problem solving, and communication skills. Before joining the Greenway Trust, he served as the chief scientist for the World Wildlife Fund and led a variety of strategy and conservation initiatives at the Nature Conservancy. And last but certainly not least, Jessie Israel, the Conservation and Collaboration plus Indigenous Right Relations from the Nature Conservancy. She supports the Nature Conservancy. She joined at TNC in 2015 as the Puget Sound Conservation Director and sits on the Conservation Leadership Team in Washington State. In addition to leading TNC's freshwater, stormwater, and marine conservation efforts to restore Puget Sound estuary, She is a key partner for growing TNC's culture and capacity to support community-led and Indigenous-led conservation efforts. She's proud to work with the team advancing the Conservancy Stormwater Heat Map, Stormwater Parks Initiative, Floodplains by Design, Indian Country 101 training, capacity building for equitable public funding access strategy, and other efforts towards meeting TNC's 2030 challenge. So now I am going to invite our speakers to take over and to put on their videos and let's get this going.
Morning, everyone. I'm just getting mine up to share. So welcome. We're really excited to be here to talk with you guys all today and let you know a little bit more about Indian Country 101 and what it is and how it came to be, and then hear more from John kind of on a case study about how this could have helped him in the beginning. But first, we're going to start with a very small icebreaker because I'm a facilitator by trade. I want you guys to just drop a rating in the chat about how do you feel about your level of experience and knowledge in doing tribal engagement work. So one is, you've never met a Native person. You can't say that anymore. You have now met me. Or 5, I am Native. I work with 1 million tribal governments. There aren't 1 million tribal governments, so most people are probably not going to be a 1 or a 5. But go ahead and drop it in the chat. I'm just curious. My joke here is that I do this as a living. Part of the thing that's not in my bio is that we've really moved into this space of doing a lot of tribal engagement work with organizations that are trying to work better with tribes. And I would still only rate myself a 3 or a 3.5 on most days. There's, all tribes are different and there's so much to learn. So I could see everybody dropping it in there. Perfect. So we do these things called book clubs that Jessie might talk a little bit about. And this is one of the exercises that we do to kind of kick off those book clubs for people that are going through the curriculum. But I'm going to start with what is this thing that we're even here to talk about? So Indian Country 101 is a series of lessons. There are 6 of them, and they take about 20 hours to do. They are free. They are developed by the Whitener Group and TNC, and they have joint ownership, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But really, they were my attempt to help do a tribal engagement toolkit, and they developed over time. They started with I make a joke that I was hired to do 102C, which is Washington lesson about natural resources kind of focus. But as we moved through it, what happened is that there was so much national content that we started to pull it out from the Washington and created the first 3 lessons. So Indian Country 101A is a crash course in Native history. It is the longest of all of the courses. It became a passion project of mine, and people in my office joke that I'm really good at getting in rabbit holes. And so 101A is really a result of that kind of love of history. And you can go through it in a number of different ways. You can click on all of the links and be in that course for the rest of your life, or you go through it a little bit more, just go through the lessons and then dive back into it later. So, and then 101B is Tribal Governments Today. It's a shorter lesson. So is 101C, Identity, Citizenship, and Culture. And those are all a national focus and an attempt to give people a foundational understanding, because what we also found when we started doing this work is that you can't do tribal engagement without knowledge and context, and that it's really hard to work in Indian country without the history behind it, and that you could start at 101B, and a lot of people want to, because 101A is very long, the history. But that without that foundation of, the Marshall Trilogy and all of those things, that it's really hard to understand 101B or 101C, and even harder to understand when you get into Washington focus. So the first 3 lessons are really that foundation. And then Washington 102s, I know we have people from across the country, but right now there are 3 lessons that are very Washington tribe focused. And right now, Jessie and I are also working on future 102s. So trying to expand this across the country to address more areas. 102s to get more specific. I am the narrator in that, in these lessons, which always makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But what we found as we went through development was that I wanted to separate myself from the many experts that are featured in this curriculum. I am not the expert in all things. That is not what I'm about, or would ever present myself as. But I wanted to make sure when I was inserting my own voice that it wasn't put in with the experts either. So you'll hear my voice a lot. I apologize in advance if you go through the course, you'll hear this voice. But that we wanted to make sure that all of the tribal voices were elevated. There's resources of tribal businesses, there's music, there's all of the images are primary source images from like the Library of Congress and the history lesson, for example. So you'll see just a huge amount of content in the lessons that you could really dig into if you want, or move through more quickly if you're in a hurry. So, but it took 3 years, and like I said, Jessie will talk a little bit more about that, about why this thing exists. But it was a pretty long process to get here, and we're really looking forward to moving into other regions on the 102s. This kind of became I'm not trained in adult learning styles or in curriculum development, but now I feel like I am just through this process. And we wrote these learning objectives to kind of keep me focused. There was many times where I was talking to some of our experts and they'd be like, I'm going to answer this question, but this is not 101. Like, this is 10 or 205. What are you doing? Don't put this in your curriculum. And so I had this up on my wall for a long time. Like, does what I'm putting in there help people offend Native people 50% less and work 25% more effectively with tribes? So that kind of became the goal of the curriculum, is to give you that foundational knowledge and tips and tricks as you go through about how to do tribal engagement more efficiently. And not, even though maybe there's still a lot of content in there, especially in 101A, but that this really is 101 knowledge. And it's something to a lot of the comments we get online or in this post surveys is that, why wasn't this taught? I don't know. It should have been, right? Washington's getting a lot better with their historical overview that includes tribes. But I think it still is very true that a lot of us didn't get this. Even I make a joke that I grew up with tribal administrators. I have, worked at my tribe since I was 17. And then before I did the consulting work, but that I felt like I still had all of the kind of how things worked, but not why they worked that way. And so a lot of this foundational knowledge is important for people who are Native as well. And that having a place to that's a curated place, because I also learned there's a lot of things out there that are really inaccurate, was a great resource to have. So that's the learning objectives of the curriculum. We talk about why nothing like this exists. There are a lot of Indian Country 101. There's a lot of generic, very high level. There's a lot of deep dives, by scholars and academics, but that middle ground doesn't exist. And we discovered why it didn't exist is because it's really freaking hard to do. So as Jessie was really my partner in crime in this, and it just became really apparent that it's hard to create a static training, and it's hard to write down some of the things that make people uncomfortable as well. And so the magic of the TNC kind of Whitener group partnership was that they really allowed me a lot of freedom to put in topics from different perspectives, and that was really Jessie and her commitment to creating this kind of curriculum. And so I make a joke about why these exist. You'll go through, there's these little scenarios about helping this random guy. And that all happened because I forgot that Jessie had the preview link to the course live. And I was on retreat and starting to get frustrated in my own processes and started making these joke HR things. And Jessie messaged me and was like, I love that new stuff you're adding to the curriculum. And I was like, oh yeah, I forgot. You could see all that. And we had to have we had a TNC meeting about like Jennifer's sarcasm level and what everybody was comfortable with. And TNC really, I think, was so supportive in that process. And it was actually really fun. The whole thing was fun and frustrating. Sometimes I threw things, not at TNC, my own processes. But we're really excited that there's a static training. And then we do some complimentary live trainings. There's a lot of webinars out there that you could do that have more of a legal focus. There's other resources for tribal engagement that have more of a cultural focus, but this one is really focused on how to work with tribal governments, and specifically the federally recognized tribes across the country. So we're excited about it. It's very multimedia. My other plug is to remember that you can actually use it. It's really mobily optimized. It works well on a phone. It works well on a tablet, on your computer. The program that I eventually taught myself very in depth really does a lot of that functionality really well. Let's see. Oh, and then my last thing is that you do not get a certificate. One of my other jokes is that we first started this and we had one version of this training that we kind of launched, and people are like, well, we always have a certificate or a thing at the end of the training. It'd be great to have that. And I was like, no, I can't give anybody a tribal engagement certificate. I don't trust people yet that they won't show up at a tribe and be like, I am certified to engage with you by Jennifer. And then I'll be run out of Indian country. So you don't get a certificate, but you get a lot of resources that I hope that you enjoy using and that you come back to, and it's free and you can send the link around. That's the other question I get. Anybody can use it. And I really think that TNC has been great about making that resource really available to anybody who wants to utilize it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jessie to talk about all the things I'm sure I forgot to say, and why does it exist in general?
And thank you so much. And I'll say, in a 30-year career working in conservation, working on this project with Jen and the Whitener group has been a highlight. And I came to conservation from county government, where I worked for King County for almost 15 years before I joined the Nature Conservancy, and worked on salmon issues, worked on natural resource issues for that entire time. And now I'm embarrassed looking back at everything that I didn't know and the history and context that I didn't know. When I came, you can go to the next slide. When I came to the Nature Conservancy, it was to lead our freshwater, our cities and stormwater and marine bodies of work across Puget Sound. And for those who don't know, Puget Sound is the estuary in Western Washington. We call it the land of 10,000 rivers and streams. And in Puget Sound alone, there are 19 federally recognized tribes. And at the Nature Conservancy, we realized that we weren't going to meet our conservation outcomes by buying land. We had to really partner with other organizations and change how land management happened and change behaviors and work on policy. And that meant working with a huge network of conservation practitioners. I call it from the .coms, .orgs, .edus, and .govs. And, our floodplains by design network is 1,000 conservation practitioners across Washington state. Our stormwater network is hundreds of stormwater and utility leaders from across Puget Sound. And all of those, our marine work and shellfish work, are all working with conservation organizations across this landscape. And what I found is really the history and working with tribes and knowledge about treaties, everything that's in Indian Country 101, time immemorial to present day, is critical knowledge that comes up in real time in your day-to-day work. And for many folks, it just passes us by as not and without recognition of the importance of stopping and understanding the history. And that causes harm. It perpetuates increasing harm that we really wanted to nip in the bud. So we created this training to really, when we looked at trying to do training, there were some trainings that were live trainings, but that wasn't scalable to this huge network of folks working across our state. And so we wanted to create something that was free, that any organization could use, be it a small 2-person shop or a large organization like the Nature Conservancy, the Wilderness Society, a foundation, even local, state, and federal governments. So the goal was to create an online free self-paced training that took no more than 20 hours to complete. And that's what we have delivered to you as of a year ago. The goal was to start small with Washington and eventually create something that we could build over time. And that's where we're at right now. Okay, next slide. You know, as the Nature Conservancy, we're not an Indigenous organization. And I just will recognize that we are part of our history, is part of colonial history, that around land management and land and locking up land. And as part of facing that history, I think I realized that this was something that an organization like the Nature Conservancy could bring to as an initial first step to lighten the burden of education on our Indigenous colleagues, that it shouldn't be up to my Indigenous colleagues to educate me about what sovereignty means, or what specific treaties mean, or what usual and accustomed areas may have treaty reserved rights. And the goal of this training was to help level set so that we could start having the same conversation with our partners and have the same context, the same definitions, and really try and figure out how we can maybe start moving toward in a more collaborative way towards working towards supporting Indigenous-led conservation. Next slide. The training, as we ventured in to make this training, I realized my own limitations. I am not an Indigenous person myself. TNC, the Nature Conservancy, is not a Native organization. And I'll say, you know, we hired Jen and the Whitener group to work with us, and I'll say, you know, is it fair to say, Jen, we crashed and burned the first time we built it. We tried to use kind of a typical curriculum development approach, and it just felt wrong. It felt wrong to have third-party narration and to feel like and as we were going through the training after we had spent so much time building it, and that was the point when we really pushed a reset, when I looked in the middle of the night one night to see Jen's demo and saw her snarky, sarcastic wonderfulness. And we decided to reboot the whole project and lean into what felt right what felt right for this training. And what felt right was to elevate uncensored Indigenous voices in all of the myriad of complexity and variety. And you know, there are 574 federally recognized tribes in Alaska, Native tribes in the US, and they don't always agree. They don't always have the same background, the cult. Like I don't always agree with my husband, and I married him. Like, I don't know why we would expect all of that tribes would all agree. And that's what we really wanted to try and represent was diversity and complexity and beauty that really you need to try and understand before you're going to work in Indian country. So we partnered with the Whitener group. You can go to the next slide. There's Jen, who is our lead narrator, but she brings in Bob, who's her father, and Ron, who's her uncle. So we have these 3 Whiteners. Ron, who is a tribal judge and Indian law expert, Bob, who is a policy go-to person, has helped us navigate in policy issues for many years, and Jen. And they together, the three of them, have helped us build this training so that it is available to all of us. Right now, you can go to the next slide. Right now, we launched just over a year ago. And I think as of this morning, we're up to 3,005 learners since March of last year. And you can see where learners are coming in from. It's not just the Nature Conservancy, although I'm proud to say that we have almost 900 TNC employees from around the world who are now going through the training. But we have folks from every .com, .org, .edu, and .gov who are participating in learning in this training. One of my fun facts is Lush Cosmetics has a huge percentage of their employees are going through the training, which just makes me want to go out and buy a bath bomb, you know. Next slide. So what's up next? We are learning now how organizations can go through, bring this training, and supporting organizations to bring this training to their employees. Jen mentioned that we have book clubs that we've launched, and I have resources for anybody that is interested. I have how to run a book club resource. So you can have employees go through the 10 hours of Indian Country 101 trainings, and then we give you some resources and tools to bring that cohort of learners together on a semi-regular basis to talk about what they've learned. We will continue to update the training. We're fundraising for the development of new 102s for around the country, and partnering with and finding partners and in indigenous partners in other parts of the country to partner with on building those new trainings. And really want to follow the same model where we are elevating music, we're elevating culture, we're elevating the history, and in a way that is very approachable and even fun. I've had a lot of comments in our survey that this is, I'm proud to say that folks love Jen. They love your sarcasm, they love your snark. And that it's the most fun that they've had in a training in a long time is something that I hear a lot. So with that, hopefully folks are intrigued about this training. And I'm gonna pass to John, who maybe has some learning experience about kind of his pathway to working in Indian country.
Thank you, Jessie. Thank you, Jen. Hi, everybody. My name is John Hoekstra, and I'm the executive director of a small nonprofit based in Seattle, Washington, called the Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust. And Jessie and Jen invited me to join you all today to share a little bit of my story, which did not benefit from this training. So I got to learn a bunch of lessons the hard way, and I really appreciate what this resource now offers to people like me and maybe people like you to help to learn how can you, and I love the learning objectives. They're exactly right. How can you offend Native people 50% less and be 25% more effective? So I'll begin just by setting some stage. So thanks, Jen. The Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust, like I said, we're a small nonprofit based in Seattle, Washington, and for 35 years, we have focused on conserving and enhancing the Mountains to Sound Greenway landscape, which you see on this map here. We've worked with the Nature Conservancy and other land trusts to conserve land. We work on habitat restoration. We work on enhancing public access to public lands, environmental education. And we've worked on this landscape, like I said, for about 35 years. And in 2019, Congress designated the landscape a national heritage area. There are about 60 NHAs across the country. They are landscapes where the natural cultural, and historic resources combined to form a nationally significant landscape and to tell an important chapter in American history. And so we are really proud and excited to receive this designation. And along with it came a charge from Congress to develop a collaborative management plan that was to be done in consultation with the Snoqualmie, Yakima, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Colville tribes, which sounded great to us, but wow, I hadn't thought about all those tribes, and we better get to it. And so we very earnestly, I wrote a letter to the tribal chair of each of the 6 tribes, proudly sharing that we'd been designated as a heritage area, asking if we could schedule a time to meet with them or somebody that they appointed to talk about how would they like to be engaged and how would they like to be involved in this. And it was mostly crickets, but we did have some relationships with folks at the Snoqualmie tribe, and they said, oh, we'd be happy to meet. And so we had a very lovely meeting, and they conveyed their desire to participate and to provide input on this plan. We also received a response from the Tulalip tribe to say they'd be happy to meet. They wanted to let us know they did not support the designation, but now that it was designated, they had input. They wanted to make sure that we heard. And so we kind of, earnestly dove into this. That was in 2019, and it seemed to be just a matter of weeks, maybe it was months if we were lucky, before we, and royal we, the Greenway Trust, but it's on me as the executive director, we found ourselves not just stepping into some mud, but we sort of fell headfirst into a really sticky situation where we poked our heads in between dispute between 2 sovereign nations without understanding the nature of the dispute, without knowing the tribes, and it was terrible. It was a physically uncomfortable situation to be in, because I very quickly learned, I got a crash course in what sovereignty means. These weren't just organizations like the agencies or nonprofits that we worked very comfortably with. These were sovereign nations. There were disputes that weren't any of our business, but we had gotten ourselves caught in the crossfire. We were in no position to resolve those differences, but we had to find our way out. And so right at the time when we were supposed to be working with these 2 and 4 other tribes, we went from kind of very excitedly beginning conversations to having one tribe refusing to talk with us for 4 months. And when we finally were able to kind of surface some communication, we were given some very pointed direction through a designated third party. You need help. And the other tribe said, yeah, you need help. And what I'm really grateful for to this, I'm grateful for many things. It was a hard spot we found ourselves in, but the representatives from these tribes, they gave us a lot of grace. They told us we needed help. And then they suggested that we call Bob Whitener. And then I called Jessie, who said, yeah, you should call Bob. And I'm really lucky. I was right about the same time y'all were probably starting to work on the training, that Bob agreed to help us out. And what followed, well, let me back up. Let me stop there. So that I got you down into the why we had a problem and how we got some help from Bob. Let me go to the next slide. Why was I such an idiot? Why was I so naive to this? And I think I want to just try to unpack a little bit of the fundamental learning I had to go through. I don't have a pointer, but if you look at this map and you see Seattle, and if you look kind of in the middle of the map and you see a little town called Ellensburg, that's the Greenway corridor. And if you look at that map in our landscape, there's only one reservation. It's the Snoqualmie Reservation. It's really tiny. Congress said, work with Tulalip, work with Muckleshoot, work with Colville, work with Yakima. I was like, okay, but the reservations aren't in our area, and like Colville's really far away. Yakima is pretty far away. So okay, I just didn't get it. I was naive, I was ignorant. One of the fundamental things I learned after learning about sovereignty was that our landscape, tribes aren't where their reservations are. That's not Indian country. That's not tribal territory. If we go to the next slide, tribes in Washington, before it became a territory of the US and before the US government came and displaced tribes, all of this land was tribal land. And it was the tribal land of, it was the land of many different peoples and bands. And in the 1850s, a representative of the US government was sent out to negotiate, and I'm going to do air quotes, negotiate treaties with those tribes where they ceded their territory in exchange, many, not all, many ceded their territory in exchange for moving to a reservation where they got a whole bunch of promises, and US government and then settlers who followed got a whole lot of territory. And so most all of what today is the Greenway National Heritage Area, it is ancestral territory of lots of different peoples who got pushed off their land. They got pushed into different reservations that included the Tulalip Reservation, it included the Muckleshoot Reservation, it included the Yakima Nation, included the Colville Reservation. And so people who live outside of the Greenway today have roots that go back countless generations in this landscape. And that's why we need to work with them. That's why we need to appreciate this landscape and its tribal roots. And so I'll just pause there. This was just, I wanted to just try to offer an entree. After falling into it, after getting mired in it, stopping and realizing I need to go back to basics. I need to learn who are tribes. Why do we have these tribes on these reservations today? Who were these people for time immemorial? What is the landscape that my organization is committed to working on? What does it mean to Native people? How do we bring their history and their heritage forward to understand this landscape, to understand how do we steward it? How do we conserve it? How do we protect it? How do we make sure that it's going to be there into the future? And that's been a long journey. I've been really lucky to get to work with Bob for several years and sort of learn from him in bits and pieces as we've worked through our planning process. And then when this training launched last year, I took my whole team through it just because I want everybody on my team to try to have some of these fundamentals. It is 101. 20 hours isn't enough. But I hope you all take it. It's a really valuable experience. Sorry, Jen.
No, that was me trying to manage the chat and accidentally advancing slides.
I thought you were telling me to wrap it up.
I was not actually. That's only when I got Bob and Ron on the call that I'm like, advance. We've gone into a rabbit hole on the dirt for an hour, you know.
Bob told me, listen to Jen. Always.
Oh, I wish he took his own advice more.
So I know that there are, I mean, I think one thing that, John, I appreciate about the path that you've taken is the recognition that this isn't a one and done thing. Like, this is not something where you're going to take a 1 hour event, you're take a 1 hour workshop and then know what you need to know. This is something this is lifelong learning. And the 101 series is relevant to everywhere in the United States. We could probably add a little more content for Hawaii, I think, and that's in the someday category. But yeah, you should be able to, anywhere in the United States, you should be able to get the basics by going through Indian Country 101. And And, but it really is putting a foot on the path to lifelong learning. I was kind of the user 1.0, and I have gone through it 5 or 6 times. I sit, while waiting for my kid to finish gymnastics class, doing lessons on my phone. I listen to interviews about the fish wars in Washington State while on my commute. This is something that I return to again and again, and hope that, and feel like I should have learned a lot of this in high school, and I didn't. So I'm hoping that others will kind of join us on that learning path.
Yeah, and I want to talk, I think the Greenway story and the other, the curriculum, when we did the interviews, we did a bunch of interviews because this was started with floodplains by design practitioners that were really struggling with, that integrated floodplain management and how to work with tribes. And we did interviews with people on, with the tribes that they were already working with. We did interviews with the practitioners that were non-tribal that were trying to work with tribes to figure out kind of what the disconnect was. And what we heard over and over again is that if you don't have a foundation and you aren't willing to put the time in to get that foundation yourself, you can never move beyond a base level partnership development. You can't do complicated land negotiations with the tribe if you don't understand how we think about land. And, it's really hard to do a national course. And I'm going to address one of the questions that was in the chat that I typed an answer to about how you talk about these things in an objective way. But that was really what we just kept hitting against. Tribal leaders were saying that. They were saying, well, there's turnover in these organizations. There's a whole section in the Washington curriculum about kind of that county government relationship to tribes in Washington, specifically because that's a lot of the intergovernmental work that's kind of struggling because it's not well defined on how counties are supposed to work with the tribes. In Washington State, we have the Centennial Accord, which defines more than a lot of states have about how the state agencies are supposed to work with tribes. We have tribal liaisons. And a lot of that is due to co-management and the treaty rights. And that is not the case of tribal relations with tribal state relations across the country by any means. Co-management really forced the state to come to the table with tribes to be able to do kind of that work. And so what we're finding too nationally is that foundational knowledge is even more lacking than and sometimes that you get in Washington because of these other systems that we've set in. There's other states that have agreements like that. I believe Michigan, and these tribes that are these states that have a lot of tribal, federally recognized tribes in their areas get a little bit more tools in that way, just by nature of geography. But it's just that they, people, even some people tease me about the 101A course. Like, do I really have to do that one? And I'm like, well, you don't have to. I'm not making you do anything. You get to choose your own path in life. But do I suggest you do it? I do. But I also am not a linear person. So you can do 101B first and then go back to the history. But Jessie is correct. You got to put in the time to kind of learn the thing if you want to do that kind of relationship building.
Yeah. I do see one question in the Q&A about how do you create an objective course that when there's so many sticky relationships. And I just want to say, that was part of the challenge. And that's what makes this so, I think, Jen, the work that you did so magical. We found that when we were looking for tribal engagement trainings, live trainings, nobody would allow us to record them, and which is part of what made it hard to make them scalable beyond just a few staff to an entire team or an entire community, because trainers wanted to be able to talk about those sticky wicket things without an intertribal and how to navigate intertribal relationships without being recorded, so it would never come back to them. And we had to navigate that. We had a team of advisors from Indian country for this training that Jen worked with to really try and figure out if we could give some general information that helps give context to sticky issues, or use firsthand experience for Jen and Ron and Bob navigating sticky issues as a way of helping folks learn so that they could figure out how to navigate it on their own. But it was touching.
Yeah. And that question actually ties to the other question in the chat about working with tribes that are not federally recognized. So, when we talk about when we have live sessions with Bob and Ron too, Ron does this historic overview a little bit more in depth than you'll find in the curriculum. And the reason he does that is to explain kind of intertribal politics, right? In a way that is objective, because it's really talking about, these are the bands that signed the treaty. This is the successor in interest. Why there's tension between, specifically in Washington, why there's tension between tribes that were more recently recognized versus ones that had been federally recognized for a long time, and why there's tension between those two tribes just by the nature of how the treaties worked and how the reservations were created. And so it's really hard to do. And so that's why the static training is kind of that foundation. And then I think there's still lots of resources out there for live trainings where people can get more into the specifics in a geographic, region to talk about those intertribal politics. Our tips and tricks there are that, some tribes in certain parts of the country really support the tribes that are not federally recognized in their areas for various reasons. And that, in the Pacific Northwest, this is not a secret. There's a lot of tension between Duwamish and some of the federally recognized tribes. There's a whole website about it. And so most of the time, what I advise people is just to make sure that they know the issue, that they're not kind of stumbling into that blindly, making assumptions that all the tribes around a tribe that is not federally recognized are supportive of that recognition process. And we've run into this, across the country, and some of our tribal engagement work, same thing, where the federally recognized tribes are saying, no, those ones are not legitimate in our eyes. And so we want you to just work with the federally recognized tribes in this process. And so most of it is kind of beginning to just know that you need to do your homework, and how you might go about doing that homework is kind of what we present in the static curriculum, and then encourage people to get more in-depth knowledge. We're not experts across the country in this. We're specifically, very knowledgeable about Washington tribes, but that there's other people across the country that can help you kind of do what John did, which is what I call phone a Bob, right? Like you can find your own Bob somewhere that can kind of help you know what landmines you might be walking into. So.
Yeah.
I'll maybe add another thing from the perspective of a learner in this space. I was just thinking back. So it's been almost 5 years that I've been leaned in trying to do this really earnestly. And last week I got to have conversations with 3 of the 5 tribes I work with. So it was great. And all on different, well, they were connected, but different topics, independent conversations. And each of them I learned something, like a new little insight or tidbit about their tribe, something about their history, something about the things they're working on. And maybe I'll offer, I'm going to guess that some of you on this call, at least some of you are biologists by background. I am too. And to me, what this training course is like, this is like doing all your prereqs before you get to all the advanced, upper level ecology courses that are what I loved. But before you can do that, you kind of have to get the basics about cell biology and genetics and basic population biology. There's so much that the conversations I had last week, I couldn't have understood them. I couldn't have learned from them if I didn't have some grounding, because there's so much context and background that as you begin to appreciate it, you begin to understand why things are said, why those things that are said are important and what they mean. And so, this course, it's 101, it's 102, it's a fixed thing, but it's the platform that if you're interested or you need to try to work with tribes in your work, it's the kind of platform you really need in order to even just to get to the second step, right? It's the first platform that allows you to start climbing the stairs.
Yeah. I now keep a list. I have a list of advisors that the Nature Conservancy calls upon, trusted Indigenous advisors who we call upon for help in Indian country with navigating issues, be they buffalo issues, salmon issues, land back issues. And although I try and be somewhat cautious also, because I appreciate Jen and Bob's graciousness in when I ask dumb questions, and I certainly ask dumb questions. I will be the first to say, but I don't want to waste their time because I didn't do my homework. And at least now, having gone through Indian Country 101 many times, it allows me to engage even with consultants, not just with tribal governments, not just with Indigenous organizations and or non-native tribal staff, but also with the consultant team and trying to kind of have a little more context and understanding. I know we have other questions, but I know there are some questions that we get often, and maybe we want to move to a couple of those as well.
Yeah. I would just, and then we can just kind of generally, say that we're working on other content. Made a joke about adding, more about Hawaii. Sometimes Jesse's like, we need to add more about First Nations in Canada and Hawaii and Alaska. And I'm like, okay, well, that all was another 3 years of my life. I just, this is very focused on the lower 48. There is a little bit about Alaska, but the nuances of Alaska, given that there's 227 tribes up there and there's no treaties and it's ANCSCA, the land settlement agreement, it's just a very different bucket of work. And then, on the East Coast too, there's a lot of differences from what you'll find in the working with Washington tribes, but we are working on kind of expanding it across the country as Jessie and I, fundraise and things like that to kind of bring the curriculum more broad.
So testing this with our partners across the country. So right now, we have a fun fact about the Nature Conservancy. We're the second largest private owner of buffalo in the United States. Didn't realize that. The first being Ted Turner. And our buffalo herd managers are right now going through Indian Country 101 as a cohort and working, and they get together going through the 10 hours of training, national training. They're getting together 3 times over the course of 3 months to talk about what they're learning, how this content helps them in navigating issues on working with buffalo, on buffalo restoration and fire issues with our Indigenous partners in the Intertribal Buffalo Council. So as we're continuing that work, that's helping us to build the foundation for building out new trainings as well over time. So hopefully someday we'll have a Buffalo Country, Indian Country 102 too.
Yeah.
So here is a common question. Why can't you find an easy map? John, you touched on this. Yeah. Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about maps and why there's no easy map?
There is no easy map. And our next slide too is talking a little bit about land acknowledgements, which is one of our most common kind of questions that we get. But maps are really, they're hard. Like John showed the seeded area map. That's a map that we reference quite a bit, mainly because it's the most clear. But often we've done tribal engagement work where we're like, oh, we went to this federal website that I won't name, and it says these are the tribes that we need to consult with, capital C consult with, and it's inaccurate. And so part of the problem is like this slipping of data that kind of happens when people are reposting, different resources, and that the maps are a lot of the same issues that you really still have to do a lot of your homework and not just make an assumption that because another agency, even if you think it's reputable, posted a map about something or a list. It's really hard to kind of triage onto that right information without working with the tribes directly. Yeah. I think
I'll say right now I'm doing a lot of clean energy siting work across the country, where we're really trying to site wind and solar projects in places that are low conflict and that center and collaborate communities and Native Nations with on the siting. And there's kind of a pull at the Nature Conservancy. I'll find that we're just going to GIS our way out of this problem. We're going to just create a map, and it'll be a decision support tool that everybody's going to love, and it'll include the biodiversity hotspots. It'll include native lands. It'll include places that have wind and solar. And for me, going through this training really has built, and working with Jen and the Whitener group has really helped me to build the understanding that you are not going to GIS or science your way to fundamentally building trust-filled relationships. You have to relationship your way to building relationships. And that means starting small, growing over time, and not burning bridges. And that has been a fundamental shift for the Nature Conservancy, because we love our maps, and we consider ourselves a science-driven organization. And for us to really pivot and say, no, we're going to be a relationship-driven organization. We are going to ground our work in Indian country in trust. And that starts with knowing who you're working with and knowing what's important to them.
Yeah, I love data. I would love an easy map. I love maps. I love charts. I love infographics. And what I discovered even going through the curriculum, Washington, I started with like, I'm going to figure out how many, representatives are on most of ours out here are called tribal councils. That's not true across the country, right? But now there's a stat in there that how many of our tribes have tribal councils versus business committee. And data that I thought would actually be easy to verify, like people want enrollment data. Like there's no one place that tribes are required to submit their enrollment data. And so you're not going to find that data very easily. Sometimes they'll put it on their website. Sometimes they will not. And the other data that you'll see is pulled from the census, which we're notoriously, bad about filling out. There's lots of campaigns to try to get Native people to fill out the census. And so things that you think will be easy, we call that the E word. There is just, intertribal politics, data, all of those things, that none of them they're easy. They're all doable. And most of it is about kind of commitment and relationship building with tribes, and building that relationship before you need it is also kind of one of our most important tribal engagement tricks, so that you're not going to find a map. You're not going to find that, but people are people. And working with a tribal government is very similar to working with any government. And that you have to build that relationship before you need it. And you need to know kind of the lay of the land, that just because a city or county government structure might look similar to the county next to it doesn't mean that the way they work internally is going to be the same, and that you would treat those relationships in the same way, and that tribal governments are governments. And just like any kind of other engagement you're going to do, a lot of the same practices apply.
So I just wanted to let everyone know we are heading towards the top of the hour. Our speakers are planning to stay a little bit longer. They do want to work through the commonly asked questions, as well as some of the questions that you all have posted. If you have to drop, we do understand that. Our schedules are what they are, but this is being recorded. You will receive a copy of the recording, so you will have the ability to get the answers later. So I'm going to put my video back off and let you all continue.
Should I go to the next one?
Sure.
Or John, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Should I jump in on one of the other live questions? Someone was asking about how tribal engagement shaped outcomes with Mountains to Sound, and about Indigenous knowledge. I could actually maybe speak to both of those briefly. So I told you about how we got into the mess, and I kind of hinted that we've been working our way out. And I'll say one of the reasons I got to see and talk with representatives from some of the tribes last week is We were at an event to celebrate a watershed-wide resilience effort in which my organization was doing some riparian habitat restoration in one part of the watershed. One of the tribes was leading restoration in another. We have a partnership with the Snoqualmie tribe to look at traditional approaches to prairie restoration. So the tribe's taking the lead. We're in a supporting role on that. So we're looking forward to learning some new techniques from them. There was a big announcement. This was mostly led by TNC, but there's been some significantly big land conservation accomplishments of late that have been done in collaboration with the Yakama Nation, as well as a huge in-stream salmon restoration project involving thousands of pieces of woody material being put back. So, what I'm seeing and experiencing is, as we've invested in trying to build relationships with tribes, as we work through all of the mistakes we've made along the way, we're beginning to see opportunities to where the things that we as an environmental organization are supportive of and interested in are very much in line with what tribes are interested in from a perspective of preserving what really is their culture and their heritage on the landscape. And we're seeing more and more opportunities to work together. So it's really been transformative for us over the past few years.
What do we do about land acknowledgements? Question. I know, Jen, this is your favorite question.
Yes, it is my
You wanna-
favorite question. Yeah, and we spend a lot of time on this lesson because, a lot of people are really attached to their land acknowledgements. And there's mixed feelings within Indian country about land acknowledgements. I don't presume to represent everybody's opinion on those. But, Ron will speak about it more forcefully if he's on the call. He calls them a trap. He's like, sometimes they're just really hard to do. And we can just send this video out as a resource. We don't have to play it now live on the webinar, but this is a slide that we do from our live ones about, you say, do your research, but are you going to become a scholar? Are you an archaeologist? You're going to figure this out. I make a joke in Washington that sometimes I can really tell when, they've gone to one tribe to approve their land acknowledgement. Because, as Jessie said, there's sometimes intertribal politics we equate to, I'm like, pretend we're siblings, right? And maybe the closer together we are, the more we might poke each other, right? Just a little bit, just to get a reaction. And I've seen that happen on written land acknowledgements where, one tribe is doing a little dig at another tribe. And that they are complicated. And John and I actually during prep had to talk about this map, this link. And you guys will get the PDF. You can click on it. It's an Indigenous-led, mapping project. And at some point, another tribe, if you type in my address here, I'm in Olympia, Washington, it has a tribe that's not even really connected to this area. And none of the tribes that are connected to this area, I'm quite sure that the tribe is listed, is not, they would be surprised at this fact as well. And so again, we're coming back to maps. They're really hard. Or people in Western Washington will summarize as Coast Salish, but there's 3 of the 4 tribes along the coast are actually not Lushootseed. They're not that language group's base, which is, coast. That's what that's referencing, Coast Salish. And so that they can be really complicated to do. And one of the things we've been kind of working with the people a lot is moving kind of from land acknowledgements to like tribal engagement frameworks or policies or statements about how they're creating those working relationships with tribes, in real time. Because as you might have guessed, land is a pretty sensitive issue in Indian country, and that, land acknowledgements very quickly moves to land back and, kind of the complicated nature of the land back processes and things like that. So I don't know, Jessie, or, have anything else to add to land acknowledgements?
I think I'll just acknowledge that I hear a lot of I hear a lot of acknowledgements, land acknowledgements at workshops and meetings, and I'll say the vast majority of them, I think, are not action oriented. it's a kind of a performative way of somebody feeling good about what they're doing without actually doing their research, without actually doing digging in and learning and building those relationships and committing to action. And I think that's what worries me, is that we, as non-native conservationists, we can let ourselves off the hook to doing the work if we do a land acknowledgement in a way that isn't a call to action, and isn't a call to learning, and isn't a call to leading with humility. We have one super minor question left that we get quite a bit. It's just a small thing. What about land back? What can you tell us about land back? Jen, do you want to start, and then John and I can dig in?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot. I mean, TNC and I know other, organizations that deal with land have been talking a lot about this issue, and that it's not, again, it's the E word, right? Nothing's ever as easy as it seems, and that there's kind of a spectrum of approaches to this, from, full kind of land back to the tribe, versus talking with the local tribes about, is access something that they would more desire? Like that might be something that's more appealing at this moment, depending on their capacity to manage the land. And that there's a continuum of partnership development around land back. And that's why those individual relationships with the tribes in that area are so important, as opposed to kind of a cookie cutter approach to land back. That there's a lot of different models that are happening out there that provide a lot of the same, is it access to hunting and gathering, and it's private land that's different. Other parts of the country, like I said, Washington has off-reservation treaty rights, but there's only about 60 tribes across the country that actually have off-reservation treaty rights. And most of them are in Washington or the Great Lakes area. And so I'm going to pass it over to you, Jessie. Sorry, a little bit of a scratch. Or allergies.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that we at the Nature Conservancy, we're trying to trying to navigate growing the use, access, and ownership of lands by tribes and for Indigenous people and for Indigenous use. Bree Fraley, who's our former Indigenous Right Relations Director for the North America Nature Conservancy, she always challenged us to say, land back is an Indigenous calling for land back. And as a non-native organization, it's not ours to say what land should go back. It's ours to say, to respond to the call of land back. And that is a call to engage. There was a great article that I'll put in the chat in the Huffington Post that profiled Bree Fraley and Jen, that talked about land back and what we've started calling our land forward initiative, which is to think about not just ownership of land, but also to think about the use, the access, the maintenance liability over time. How do we make sure that we're supporting ongoing maintenance of land? All of the above, and recognizing that that land has many potential folks who want to use it, and different tribes who want to use it. So we need to recognize that and start with building relationships and go from there.
Okay, do we want to just, we have a couple questions that didn't get addressed. Do we mind if we take a few minutes to answer those?
Yep, that works.
Would love to. Thank you for tracking.
Yeah.
Okay, and as you can see on the screen, there's resources that'll be available. And just to say again, you will get a copy of this, a PDF of this slide deck. So let's just I know we've been trying to address them as they've been coming up, but what advice do you have for environmental focused educational organization initiating work with a local tribe and looking for ways to, in alignment with our mission, address tribal community reservation issues of economic distress and resource disparity?
Just, it's a small question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's a good question.
Yeah. So I think depending on your region, like I said, part of the advice is to create, like I said, create those relationships before you need them. And one of the things we also advise people is to anything that, tribes are really at capacity. I think there's a lot of one thing that the curriculum tries to convey is that, the tribal government is responsible for everything a government is responsible for, right? We've got economic development, we've got natural resources, Indian children and social services and, a myriad of issues that sometimes, especially, I will say, especially environmentally led nonprofits have a little bit of a struggle that they go in with some assumptions saying like, oh, the tribe's going to be ready to dedicate all this time, capacity, and resources to work on this issue. And really to understand that a lot of, tribal government staff are really, overburdened with a lot of work, and that they won't have the time or the resources to necessarily jump on a thing. And then just because you don't get a response right away doesn't mean that it's not your responsibility to kind of be the squeaky wheel to kind of and make sure that you're giving making it as easy as possible for somebody to weigh in on an issue, to not create more barriers to that than help. So I think we do a lot of work right now in Washington, specifically Bob, on the recreational impacts kind of space, right? And a lot of that was because people made an assumption that like, oh, we're trying to do more responsible approach to recreation. The tribes will be excited about it. So a lot of the tribes were like, no, we just want less recreation. You're trying to promote more recreation in our natural resources areas, and we aren't excited about that. I'm breaking up maybe a little bit, but I think that's one of my biggest advices for environmentally led nonprofits is to make sure you're questioning those assumptions about what you're expecting a tribe to do and how you're expecting them to participate, and being sensitive to the fact that, these are government employees, right? Just like every government, like I said, they're being piled under other work. So
I think one of the things that the Nature Conservancy is trying to do more of is offer low strings capacity grants and make sure that we are lobbying for tribes to get funding so that they can grow staff, state funding and federal funding so that they can grow their staff. So, and to Jen's point, that tribes, natural resources departments at tribes are working on a variety of issues, and don't get frustrated if you don't hear back. That's pretty normal. And it just means that your priority may not be their top priority. And if you start to build a relationship over time, maybe you'll learn why.
Yeah, I guess my other kind of practical tip, and Bob talks about this as like the 3-prong approach to tribal engagement. And a lot of it is kind of going in at the level that you are. A lot of people think, oh, we should go to the tribal council and start there as a show of respect. And really what makes more sense is to if you're like a technical person, to kind of develop that relationship with the technical staff level. If you're legal, developing the legal to legal relationship, and the tribal legal departments often have their finger on the pulse of everything that's kind of happening within the tribal government, just kind of the nature about how the tribal legal departments developed in Indian country. And then, if you're a leader or that kind of executive director or policy level, going in at a policy level with the intergovernmental affairs person or whatever that equivalent position is at the tribe, and developing those relationships at that appropriate level is a really helpful way to kind of think about your tribal engagement work. So.
Okay. So I have one more question. As a land trust or government, how do you know what you can legally offer a tribe across the spectrum from simple input to resource management?
am a little bit unclear about the question. You know, there's what you legally have to do in terms of consultation, depending on your region, right? There's in Washington, there's we have an executive order that says kind of if you also get state funding, you also have to do consultation, capital C consultation, with tribes on certain issues. But in terms of legally offering, I'm not 100% sure to how to answer that question without
Might-
more.
That's great.
Might be talking about kind of restrictions to land. I think one of the issues that the Nature Conservancy is challenged with at times is that the funding that maybe bought a piece of land or the grant that secured a piece of land doesn't allow you to have recreational access, to have cultural use access, to have it restricts it maybe doesn't allow you to transfer that land, the ownership of that land, to another organization, even a tribe, without some sort of conservation easement. And that gets challenging, and that's one of the reasons that we start with a relationship and saying, you know, we have the intention of opening up this land. We have the intention of figuring out how to work on this land. But there may be a history, and we need to learn about our own history. We're in the process, our New York chapter is in the process of learning about all of the lands in New York, Nature Conservancy lands in New York. And in the process of auditing those lands, what was the kind of money that bought those lands? What sort of easements, restrictions, or deed kind of things that may prevent us from transferring lands back or opening up usage for cultural use, and trying to know that before we initiate conversation. So kind of doing our own homework and doing our own audit about what those restrictions are, and potentially legal or donor restrictions before we initiate a conversation, just so we know what we know and we do our homework without potentially burning a bridge down the line.
Okay.
I'll maybe add on this one that it's the relationship building and the conversation I think is super important. There's a conserved natural area within the Greenway. It was one of the very first projects that was done by the Greenway, and it was jointly managed by the two adjacent cities, and it was a 25-year management agreement that expired. And there were good intentions to make the new agreement between the two cities and the nearby tribe, because this was an old prairie that the tribe would have maintained way before your white settlement came into play. And those negotiations have not been fruitful yet, but it's only been like 2 years. And in the arc of 12,000 years of tribal presence, and even in the arc of 25 years of this kind of modern conservation on this, we've been trying to keep the parties at the table. Like it is my belief that a 3-party agreement would be path-breaking, trailblazing. To have a tribe as a co-manager with cities on something would be a great precedent to set. My goal is to keep everybody at the table talking about it. If it takes a few years, that's okay, because again, this should be about the much longer term future of this place. So even when there's questions, even when there's uncertainty, even when there's constraints, talking about them, understanding what those constraints may be, that sets the table for being able to maybe modifying those constraints in time. Working through, that's a worthy fixable problem, right? A constraint on a property is something you might be able to resolve, but founded on a really an enduring, genuine relationship.
And
I see one last
Go ahead.
question, and about, for example, if multiple tribes want to have access via conservation easement, but they don't want to share it with another tribe, how do you navigate that? And how do you navigate when you're launching a conservation partnership with one tribe and not multiple tribes? And for the Nature Conservancy in Washington, we, a few years ago, we started on a path to develop an equity statement for the Washington chapter. And that really grounded our work in working on environmental justice and equity issues. And our equity statement is on our webpage, washingtonnature.org. And then just this year, we also went through the work, which was kind of self-reflective work, mostly self-reflective work, working with our staff and working with our board of trustees to develop a statement of commitment to Indigenous peoples. And that statement of commitment does ground our Nature Conservancy in Washington's commitment that we will not work exclusively with one tribe over another tribe. And we try and stay out of intertribal issues that we are and recognize when we're not welcome. But having our statement of commitment open, available, guiding our work for our staff, our board, our fundraisers, everybody across our organization is really helpful for us to ground our conversations, especially when we get into conversations where we might get pulled into one area or another, and the recognition of where our limitations are, what we're committed to and where our limitations are. And our statement of commitment and an equity statement and how we developed them are on our webpage.
Okay, well, we're well over now. Is there anything you wanted to share? Did you have any other slides that you needed to show? Just want to make sure we don't cut you off. Okay.
No, there are social media graphics in this presentation and on the Whitener Group's resources page that we created freely so that other folks wouldn't have to create them. Feel free to use them, feel free to spread the word. Please encourage your teams to go through the training and tell us how it went for you, because we are always adapting it and updating it. So we would love to hear back.
And that was our goal today, is just to let more natural resource professionals know about this opportunity, because we know a lot of you work in this space and it's very complicated. And we're all trying to do our best, but there's so much we don't know. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for all that you put into this resource. I know that NAA as a staff, we're planning to engage in the training. So it will just one person at a time, we will all make a difference. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.